EVO. Welcome back to The Devil Within and our ongoing re-release of Season 1. We're up to Episode 4, Spring and Fall to a Young Child. And just to remind everybody, the reason I'm doing this is in support of the MGM Plus docuseries Let the Devil In, which is based on Season 1 of the podcast. And the show's doing great. And I'm sure I have all of you to thank. There have been a ton of new subscribers to the MGM Plus platform. And it was just announced yesterday that Let the Devil In had officially overtaken MGM Plus's previous #1 original show From on their platform. So we're thrilled with how the show is performing. And again, I'm sure we have all of you to thank. So thank you for watching the show, for connecting with the show, for telling your friends about the show, for reviewing the show, anything having to do with it. I can't thank you enough for being with me on this whole journey for the podcast. And now as we transition to the TV version of it, I just couldn't be prouder or couldn't be happier. So thank you very much. So let's get to this week's episode, A Spellbound Palace. So A Spellbound Palace is a poem by Gerard Manley Hopkins, who was a 19th century English poet and Jesuit priest who died young. He was only 45 years old when he died and was unknown as a poet during his lifetime. He wasn't published until after his death, when a friend of his found a collection of his poems in his effects and sent them to a publisher, and they went, yeah, this is great. And posthumously, he became one of the most influential poets of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Now, Spring and Fall to a Young Child is one of his lesser known works, but it is hands down my favorite poem that he ever wrote, and one of my probably top 5 poems of all time, because it's so simple and it lands, at least with me, it landed so hard when, as like a 16, 17-year-old kid, when I actually understood, when I was like, whoa, I get what this fucking guy's trying to say. Like, I got it. I was able to kind of penetrate the Victorian kind of language and the made-up words, because he made up words in it, which we'll get to in a second. But I understood it. And the weight of the poem, I carried that around for a while, in a good way, and not in a sad kind of melancholy way, but just in a very contemplative, like, whoa, I get it kind of way. So basically the setting for the poem is some big property in the English countryside, and there's a young girl named Margaret. In my mind, she's 7 or 8 years old, and she's looking out the window at the beautiful property in this huge grove of trees. And it's autumn, and the leaves are falling. And someone walks into the room, an adult, and observes this girl looking out the window and crying. She's sad at what she's looking at. And it starts this whole meditation on the central theme of the poem, which is, the poem starts with, the girl's name is Margaret. And the poet is speaking directly to her. And he asks, "Margaret, are you grieving over Golden Grove unleaving?" And that's one of the words he made up, unleaving. That isn't really a verb about leaves falling from trees. He made it up, but it was a beautiful rhyme with grieving, and we know what he's talking about. So, Margaret, are you grieving over Golden Grove unleaving? And then there's an introspective pause from the speaker when there's an internal question, and he says, "Leaves like the things of man, you with your fresh heart care for, can you?" Like he's going, wait, she's just a little kid, and she's ascribing an adult level of sadness to leaves falling from the trees. And he gets it. He understands that where she is in her contemplation of the nature of life, I guess. And then the next question, or the next statement, is to the girl. As the heart grows older, it will come to such sights colder. Like, as you grow up, you won't give a shit about leaves falling, right? And he says, by and by, nor spare a sigh. The worlds of when would leave me a lie. Like, you won't even take the time to go, won't even spare a sigh. If leaves around the entire planet are falling off the trees, you won't care, because you'll have grown up, and that concern will be better placed on more adult worries. Then he drops some truth on her. So this universal truth. He says, now no matter, child, the name, sorrow's springs are the same. basically saying that regardless of the reason, whatever it is you're sad about in the future, all sorrow comes from the same place. And so he ends with a couplet, and in his subtle genius, he brings us back to the beginning where we're looking at a grove of trees, and he gets us back into that arboreal kind of world again by using the word blight. A blight like the great American chestnut blight. Like there's no more American chestnut trees. There used to be like 6 billion chestnut trees on the East Coast from like Maine down to Georgia, and they're gone because of a blight. It's a disease that specifically kills a specific species of tree. Okay. Chestnut blight. Bad news, because chestnut was awesome wood to work with and for furniture and flooring, whatever, and it's gone now. Okay. So a blight. It's an unavoidable death. So in the final couplet of the poem, he gives an answer for what the source of all human sorrow is. And he says, it is the blight that man was born for. It is Margaret you mourn for. So the blight that man was born for, the unavoidable blight, is death. We start dying from the moment we're born. And he's letting her know that as you grow up and as you grow older and as you start to internalize that and understand that, in the poet's mind, that's the root of all human sorrow, is the acceptance of our own mortality. Basically, when you're young, you think it's the leaves, or it's the end of summer, or it's the loss of a pet. But as you grow up, you realize it's something deeper. The absolute fact that everything, including you, must eventually die. And according to the poet, all human sadness traces back to that knowledge. So I was thinking about the poem and how the protagonist was a kid, innocent, vulnerable, emotionally honest, and probably just a few years younger than Tommy was when he died. But those few years, man, what a difference, right? Tommy had begun to grow up, and he'd begun to understand some things about the world. He began to understand things like ambition and responsibility and expectation. Oof. And in that space, in that crack of daylight that opened up between the innocence of Tommy's youth and the dawn of a deeper, more mature understanding, there was just enough room for something evil to slip in and take over. So, spring and fall to a young child. I guess, to be honest, I used it more of like a wish, more of a hope of what Tommy could have been if his life had taken a different path. Because we all contemplate those deeper questions when we're kids, in one way or another. But the decisions that Tommy made took him down a path that took him to a place where very, very few people end up. So in this episode, I tried to explore Tommy, not his crimes, not what he did, but who he was, how he spent his time, and how that could have affected him, especially when it came to sports. And as a bonus, I was able to reconnect with my friend Dave Esposito, who gave us some really interesting insight on the life of a high school wrestler. So here we go, Devil Within Season 1, A Spellbound Palace. Enjoy. The actor and comedian Jay Moore grew up not far from Jefferson Township and was himself a serious wrestler from the age of 12. A serious wrestler from the age of 12. 12. And some coaches will tell you that he started a few years too late. A few years back, Mr. Moore gave an impassioned speech about the sport in an effort to keep wrestling represented in the Olympic Games. He spoke specifically about what it means to be a young man who wrestles. Here's a portion of what Mr. Moore had to say. Try and get your 14-year-old son to clean his room. You try to do that. Now take that same kid and tell him he could only eat chicken breast and spinach, maybe some fruit once in a while. He also has to get up while it's still dark out and run 5 miles before school and then stay after school and grind it out in the mat room for another 2 hours. It's a solo sport. It's a monastic life, the life of a wrestler. Running alone, working alone, testing yourself, pushing through pain and exhaustion. And there is no payoff for wrestlers. There is no turning pro. That's why they have a chip on their shoulders. That's why wrestlers don't have friends. That's why they're spitting in cups trying to cut weight. They're doing work. Tommy Sullivan was a wrestler in a wrestling school, in a wrestling county, in a wrestling state. In fact, New Jersey is often listed as one of the few states where high school wrestling is a more popular sport than high school football. He was fast, he was strong, and he was disciplined on the mat. He also wasn't afraid to put the work in. It is believed that Tommy wrestled in the 105-pound weight class, a competitive division, and he excelled. Common in the wrestling community is the practice of cutting weight. If an athlete exceeds the maximum weight for his division and is at risk for disqualification at the pre-match weigh-in, desperate measures are sometimes undertaken to ensure that the athlete will be on the mat. Fasting, vomiting, abuse of diuretics, and extreme aerobic exercise are all common practices in the sport, though never openly discussed at any level of competition. This is my friend Dave Esposito. He grew up in Jefferson. His family lived down the block from the Sullivans, and he was a competitive wrestler starting in the 4th grade. He knows firsthand the commitment required, the sacrifices, and the pressure to perform when you're a wrestler in New Jersey.
So I thought when someone said, we should maybe go to wrestling, I literally thought it was going to be like back then the WWF. I had no idea what it was. Yeah, it was definitely something that we dealt with. Again, at the time, you don't realize it. You just want to be the best that you could be. And we know, looking back, talk about sacrifice, during the high school years when people are having fun and going through growth spurts as a wrestler. My gosh, at least I was dedicated to it, and the team that we had was really good. And so, to your point, a lot of dedication in terms of diet and training. So you're not really going to parties, you're not doing that normal social stuff. You're just focused on making weight, being competitive, and I wouldn't trade it for the world, because I think it forms who I am now as an adult. But looking back to your point about stupidity of putting on a rubber suit and going out for a jog to try to make weight and that kind of nonsense, of course, was not healthy at all from a physical standpoint. Mentally, though, it makes you a really tough person.
Jay Moore. Gosh, I wish he would have talked to me. Been a fan of his for a long time. Jersey boy, North Jersey boy, Morris County boy, Lake Hopatcong boy. I mean, come on. He was right there, a couple years older than me, knows all about everything going on there, was a wrestler, understood the wrestling culture in New Jersey, and put such a fine point on it in that rant. You got to find it. It's on YouTube. You should hear him, because he gave such an impassioned plea for the sport remaining in the Olympic Games. And everything he's saying is true. And I knew kids like this. I knew kids that, like, my brother dated a girl when he was in high school whose little brother was in middle school, like 6th grade, maybe still in elementary school in 5th grade. And he would come home and he'd be like, that kid was downstairs in the basement jumping rope for an hour when I was over there. And then he was going on a run, like at night, in one of those sauna suits as an 11-year-old. And I go, what the fuck are you talking about? He goes, they're a wrestling family. Like, that's what they do. And so that was my first real kind of exposure to the monastic kind of lifestyle that these kids led. There were some movies about it eventually that came on my radar that were terrific. But I knew a lot of these kids, and they were so dedicated to their craft and to their physique and to being competitive and being in the mind frame of a warrior and of a champion. And because wrestling's not a team sport. When you're out there on the mat, your team can cheer you on and like yell things for you to do, but they can't help you like physically. It's you against the other guy. It's like me and you were the same weight by rule. Okay. So I can't overpower you with because I weigh more than you, right? It's strength and speed and skill and determination and who wants it most. So it's a very pure sport. And in Jefferson Township, it was the top tier. These guys were the high school sports gods walking the halls. And they lived up to it. They lived up to it. The year after I graduated, the wrestling team was ranked number 1 in the United States. So that culture started years before they got to high school. Most of these kids lived within a few miles of each other, and their parents were friends, and their parents were wrestlers, and they grew up together, and they grew up training together and wrestling each other and learning from each other and competing with each other and supporting each other. And so when they got to that peak, when they got to the pinnacle of high school sports on the largest stage, it was a foregone conclusion what was going to happen. You almost felt bad for their opponents. So could Tommy have been one of those kids? I argue in the podcast that he could have. He had the determination, he had the skill, he had the strength, he had the speed. If you talk to some of the wrestlers who were on the team with him, they'll tell you that. So I bring that up just to color in a little bit more of this larger canvas of the mental state that Tommy was in the weeks and the months leading up to the tragedy. Expectation, pressure, no time for himself, no release valve, no like, I'm just going to go blow off some steam and watch TV and, eat Twinkies. Absolutely not. Couldn't do it. Might not make weight. Did you do your homework? Did you do your volunteer work for the church? So there was always something. In New Jersey and most other states, there are restrictions to minimum body fat percentage. 7% and above is acceptable, and the amount of weight gained or lost in the weeks preceding the match. Coaches and administrators are duty-bound to adhere to these guidelines, but usually being former wrestlers themselves, the practices are covered up, but they're considered to be widespread in the wrestling community. When asked about growing up a few houses down from the Sullivan family, this is what Dave had to say.
Yeah. Again, nothing out of the ordinary. Family seemed to be a nice enough family. I'm going to call it your typical all-American family. Parents seemed normal. Kids seemed absolutely normal. He had a younger brother, if I remember correctly. And so, again, nothing would ever jump out at you if you're driving by the house that you would think, oh, boy, something weird or abnormal. Not at all. They were even members of our church, which is St. Thomas the Apostle Church. So, again, everything appeared to be the all-American family, just like probably many of us grew up with. No signs of anything weird going on.
The goal of a middle school wrestler is to make the varsity high school team as a freshman. The goal of a high school wrestler is an undefeated season, followed by a college scholarship. Although it was early in his athletic career, it wasn't out of the question that Tommy could well have been a scholarship athlete. He possessed a remarkable tenacity and focus level for a boy so young. Sadly, it was those very traits that made it possible for him to become what he ultimately became. Yeah, so making weight. It's one of the things that it made sense to me intellectually, but emotionally, I'm like, what are you talking about? You're gonna spit in a cup all day and lose 3/4 of a pound, and that will make a difference? Absolutely. You're gonna, wear a sauna suit in an actual sauna, so when you take it off, the sweat pours out of you like a wave leaving your body. That can't be healthy for you, and it wasn't healthy. That's the thing. These kids were starving themselves in such a caloric deficit that I don't know how they stayed on the mat in a sport that required such physical exertion and mental clarity, right? Were they feeding their bodies enough? That was the question. But apparently they were, because look at how, they enjoyed so much success, individual success as wrestlers. But you have to think about how that could affect your emotional state outside of the gym. So was Tommy in a constant caloric deficit? Was he having low blood sugar? I have low blood sugar. I'm the biggest bastard in the world. Just ask, my family. But if you're constantly in that state, how is that going to affect you? Now, I'm not saying that he was. I'm saying that we don't really know. And why? Because nobody fucking asked the kid. And that's what I keep circling back to, is that if this kid was in such distress, which he obviously was, no one was really checking in with him and saying, hey, how you doing? How are you feeling? What's going on? Now, am I going to rely on that old Gen X trope? That's just how we did it back then. No one, mental health was non-existent. That's kind of true, but also a kind of a cop-out. My mom would ask me, how are you? What's going on? Are you doing okay? How's things with your girlfriend? Or what, not these incisive, probing questions, but I would get checked in on often. So it's not like everybody was doing it, okay? There were families where their kids' well-being and mental health was a concern, okay? I think it's fair to say that it was not for Tommy because of what happened, but again, we don't know. Thanks for listening. This has been The Devil Within, Spring and Fall to a Young Child, Part 1. If you enjoyed the episode, please share it with a friend. Make sure you're following the show on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. Please rate and review. It helps more than you know. And MGM Plus, Let the Devil In. Make sure you're subscribed. All episodes will be out by the time you hear this. You can binge all 4 of them whenever you want. Until next time, stay safe out there. The Devil Within is an EVO production recorded live at Bel Air Studios in Los Angeles, California. For The Devil Within, I'm your host, Brandon Morgan.